anxious for this presentation, I bet. What a movie. I just saw it today. I'm so glad we're going to talk about it. You know, I'm Dr. Hugenberger. I run these events for some of you that are new to the school. And welcome, everybody. Wes Alwan and William Sharp both approached me separately in October and said, ooh, I'd like to talk about this movie. And they agreed to do this event together, and I am really, really happy they did. We appreciate you all coming. And let me just tell you a little bit about each of them. Somebody came to our last event on how to have an awful marriage. Anybody see that one? Because he follows your podcast, and he's a doctor at Beth Israel. Oh. So you never know where you're going to hear about us. So Mr. Alwan is a writer, co-host of the Partially Examined Life. It's a philosophy podcast. Anybody else here because of that podcast? So he is, you're recording this, right?
Yep.
For that. He's a doctoral student here at Boston Graduate School of Psychoanalysis, lives in Cambridge, where he thinks a lot about political, moral psychology of film, literature, and contemporary American culture. Special interest in psychoanalysis, of course. We've given many presentations, and your most recent one here was on Planet of the Apes. William Sharp. Dr. Sharp is assistant teaching professor at Northeastern and program director for the Master's in Mental Health Counseling program here at BGSP. Has led talks on how film reflects human drives in such movies as you've done a million movies here. Lars and the Real Girl. People see that as an amazing movie for drive theory for what we teach here. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Brokeback Mountain, Warm Bodies, and you can follow him on Twitter. So thank you both, and here we go.
Why don't you start? I wasn't prepared to start.
I can start. I just it's not very sounding very great at the moment.
Okay. You know what? Can someone make sure the video is running back there? Just look at the iPhone.
Yes, running.
Okay. Thanks. If you just say a few words, then I can.
Yeah.
Okay. That'll be.
Thank you for coming. Seeing everybody here is always fun. This is an interesting film to me because my biggest question that I left with is, it's a disturbing movie, but I didn't quite know why it was disturbing. I didn't know whether I wanted to recommend it to people or not recommend people see it. I kind of felt like I would tell people I saw it and that they should decide for themselves if they should have seen it. And I don't exactly know why. I'm not sure what it was in the movie that is so disturbing, so I'd love to kind of really get into that. And yeah, since I don't have much of a voice today, I'm really hoping that people are interested in doing most of the work in helping me understand what's so disturbing about this. I will start with, I found one quote. I was trying to figure out where to go even in psychoanalysis and Freud with this, but I found one in Jokes in relation to the unconscious. And then I thought to myself, he's a joker without a lot of jokes. It's really not humorous in a lot of ways. But I found one thing where Freud talks a little bit about two different kinds of jokes. So I thought I would just start with that and see where people wanted to go and see what you wanted to comment on it. But so here's what Freud has to say. Jokes are either hostile, serving the purpose of aggressiveness, satire, or defense, or obscene, serving the purpose of exposure. It must be repeated in advance of the technical species of the joke. Whether it is a verbal or conceptual joke, there's no relation to these two purposes. Which I thought was just as confusing as the movie, so. That seemed right. And well,
How's it sound now?
Good.
Sounds good. Okay. Yeah, so I think I was also hoping the audience would do most of the work. I told people there wasn't really a talk tonight, it was just a conversation. But what did I want to say? I think, so I had similar concerns as you, but they were more about why this film would get such a large audience. So it got an 8-minute standing ovation at Cannes. It's already the highest grossing art film in film history. It's, and it wasn't, originally I wasn't gonna go see it because I go to see superhero films anymore. There's just so many of them now, and I thought I should boycott them and only go see other types of films, which seem rare these days. But the thing that actually convinced me to go see the film was the preview of the Joker dancing down the stairs in Queens, and just the fact that it was going to be, about, there was talk of it being about someone who was severely mentally ill, and I thought that was interesting, and talk of it being dark. So I did not go to the film with high expectations, but I was very impressed by what the director Todd Phillips did with it. And the other thing, recently I saw that scene where he's dancing down the steps in his very, very triumphant way in full costume after having just, I forget who he's killed at this point, but it's something that people are like, tourists are now going to those steps in Queens, and in the movie, of course, it's Gotham, it's not Queens, but they're real steps that exist in Queens, and tourists are pissing off people who live in the neighborhood because they are doing the Joker dance. Some of them falling down trying to do it because there's lots of kicks, but doing the Joker dance down those steps, sometimes dressed up in clown makeup. So I thought that was really interesting because even though it's such a dark film, it's really seems to have captured people's imaginations. And it's not just that they think, oh, this is a great film, despite the fact that it has dark subject matter. There's an element of joy, I think, in people's responses to the film. And that's because I think that there's an element that it gives us a kind of pleasure that is actually rare in movies these days, and that is some of the pleasures that we normally see in dramatic tragedy. It's not really, the film is not technically a complete tragedy, so in a play like Hamlet or something like that, the tragic hero starts out as a great person in a sense, and then loses everything and often dies by the end of it. And in the Joker, it's a little bit more complicated because we will see him fall apart mentally, but there's a counter arc in which he will be triumphant. He will become this kind of supervillain, and I think that's actually a kind of, despite the fact that he's a villain, that a kind of triumph that the audience can identify with. So you get a very interesting kind of tragic comedy, and I think there are comic elements as well. So there's some of it really is funny, although the funniness is just in his goofy dance, for instance, down those steps, or in the goofy chase scene, which is really, so the chase scene at the very end of the movie where he's just killed, or it's implied that he's killed a hospital social worker because he's leaving bloody steps behind. But it's a slapstick chase scene in which you see him running away from orderlies. So we see him disappear down one side of the hallway, and then we see it with the orderlies in chase, and then we see him run back down the hallway again with the orderlies in chase. That's sort of a film trope, like an old Hollywood, Chaplin-esque type of comedy scene. And there are hints that Todd Phillips is consciously doing this throughout the film. So so that tragic comedy element to the film, it gives the filmmakers that make, I think, very clever use of the concept of the Joker villain, which is this whole idea of being someone who is supposed to be a comedian in some sense, but who becomes a murderer. And some of what that exploits is there is an inherent, as that Freud quote points out, there's an inherent aggression in humor, but it's aggression in sublimated form, and using it requires a certain amount of social skill and connection to people, and it's the kind that the character simply doesn't have. So he's not going to be able to, as we see in the film, successfully be a stand-up comedian, because he has too much trouble getting into the heads of an audience in order to successfully use humor. So the way he overcomes that, the way he sort of triumphs over that, is to turn humor into a practical joke gone too far. So in that case, you no longer have to cater to the pleasure or the desires of an audience, the need to win their approval, the same sort of thing that we have to do in social relations. You can just sort of force something out of people by making them fear you. And then the joke is no longer something for the audience to laugh at, it's for him to laugh at. So he laughs at he turns it around, and then he laughs at your fear. And that's his interesting solution to his particular problem, which I haven't mentioned yet, that I think that's his problem. But I think the other clever thing about the film is just I think its portrayal of mental illness is very realistic in certain ways, and the portrayal of someone who's socially isolated like that and who can't make human connection is very realistic and dark, and that's one of the things which I think is surprising, that people would want to sit through all of that. And again, I think there are various reasons that they're willing to do that. I'll just mention one more thing. One of the other ways in which I think the film accomplishes its goal of getting you to suffer through all of this and yet get pleasure out of it is through its use of dance. So I mentioned the staircase scene in Queens, but that's one of many dance scenes that really defines an arc through the whole movie. So there's an early dance scene in which he's doing it very awkwardly in his living room, and he's very aroused by the sense of power that he's gotten because he's been given a gun. And the gun goes off accidentally, sort of highlighting his ineptitude. But then after he uses that gun to kill people, the Wall Street bros who have harassed him on the subway, he does really what I think is an incredible dance scene, what I thought was really the best part of the movie, in a dirty public bathroom, public restroom. And the scoring, I forget, the score to the film is done by a Norwegian, I think, young composer who's a cellist. And so there's the music, the score to that scene it's full of both these tragic minor chord undernotes, but also little sort of angelic voices which speak to the possibility of his transcendence of a situation through violence, some martial overtones with drum beats and stuff like that. It's an incredible way to capture that, at the same time his empowerment and also the tragedy that he is going this route, the violent route. He's going to lose everything he wants, which is social connection, even if he gains this supervillain status. And the kind of dancing he does is very ballet-like, so you see him, in a way, it's his first moment of competence in the film. It's the first moment where you see him, because he seems to have complete control over his limbs. He's not just doing something goofy, although it is strange the way he dances. And then, like I said, there's the triumphant clown dance down the stairway after he sort of really started to fully began to inhabit the Joker character. So that's one of the things that I found to be really fascinating about the film. But I look forward to hearing what everyone else thinks, what it was you guys, because it sounds like a lot of people had a similar reaction and were really pleasantly surprised, let's say, by the film.
So what did you think?
very disturbing. I didn't laugh once in the film, and I remember being in the audience watching it, and I only saw it a couple weeks ago, so it wasn't a packed theater room, and I remember there was one scene, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but that one person laughed, and I remember being kind of shocked by it, because I've heard gasps in the film, but then someone laughed, and I thought, I was disturbed by the laugh too. I was just like, but I remember leaving actually feeling just bad for him. I felt for him. I think there was many moments where I just felt he's been so let down in so many ways, and I guess almost feeling a little guilty about how bad I felt for him, because he
Killed lots of people.
yeah.
It puts you
And how
really-
empowered he made other people feel because of the violence he committed. Although the first act of violence he committed, where everyone felt empowered by it, I was like, well, that was self-defense, right? I mean, he was gonna get beat to a pulp, like, so, yeah.
The part where someone laughed, a character in the film laughed, you're saying, or someone in the
No,
audience
someone in the
laughed?
audience in the theater, yeah.
You don't remember the scene that they
I
did
don't
that?
remember
Yeah.
now, but I just remember being I was disturbed by the laugh.
I think I remember, wasn't that when the midget guy couldn't reach the lock
Yes.
on the door,
yes.
and
So did people laughed when I watched him in that
yeah,
scene?
so he that was a violent scene where
Yeah.
he went off against his old coworkers, but he spared the short man, and they were laughing because he couldn't reach, the Joker had put the chain up on the thing and he couldn't reach it,
Yeah.
so they laughed, but he ended up sparing him,
Yeah.
he had a violence.
Right.
But that's what I remember when people laughed.
I do think that was probably like, I mean, it sounds bad, but that was like a really pleasurable scene for me for whatever reason. Like it was like you. I mean, it was like difficult to watch, but it just was like it's almost like I feel like I felt his apathy or whatever, because it just felt like it looked like it felt so good to do that, and I don't know. So like when I left the movie, I felt like high, like it was like such like like I had a really positive reaction, which
Felt so good to do which part?
like when he's like beating the guy against the wall, like before the midget scene, like it's just like it, like I mean, like I had to turn my head away, but like after I felt like I don't know, like a rush kind of from it. So I mean, I feel like I felt, I mean, probably not what I'm supposed to feel, but that's.
Well, I don't know if you are not supposed to feel it, but I think part of the pleasure of this movie is that we get some sort of social justice into those aggressiveness, like the violence of it is the result of so much injustice, so much denigration, and I feel that it's disturbing because it's hard to see that we all do have our part in a lot of the mental illness of others. And then we have all these people, and then we condemn them to jail after having suffered all this much. And when you see in the screen that little moment where at least they can go out and then be this violent, it's a bit of a.
Even that when the talk show host, when he called him on it, like the reason you invited me here is just to make fun of me. Like just that, when he said that and how he summed up the movie, I forget now because it's been a few weeks since I've seen it, but there was a line he said where I was like, I mean, he hit the
He's
nail on
such a
the
villain, right?
Yeah, it's just like, this is the result of society failing people like me. Like, I forget exactly what he said. I don't know if you all remember, if anyone here remembers, but
I think you're thinking of the knock-knock joke, which is the way he leads into the killing.
Well, he says, what do you get if you combine a misfit loner with a society that's forgotten about him?
Yeah.
Like this is what you get, that's like kind of like the whole theme.
it's like just that. I mean,
aside from the implied murder of the orderly, which might reflect a transformation at the end, all of the victims, to kind of paraphrase a phrase from the musical Chicago, they all had it coming. And it created, I think, a lot of identification. It created a lot of identification with them, which is part of maybe why you have people dancing on the stairs in Queens and so forth. And also a lot of catharsis against injustice and so forth. So when you think about who the victims were, it kind of set up identification with him too. And it was almost like you wouldn't mind if you found those kids who beat him up and he took care of them too, you know? Like that would have been okay, you know, that's how it felt.
So I think, I think a lot of the reason why movies even exist is so that we can go and enjoy violence. That's, you know, going to movies just to enjoy seeing people killed is a big thing. And usually there's a very typical pattern by which that's all moralized, right? You get good guys and you get bad guys, and even a typical superhero movie, you know who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and the violence is never out of proportion to the injury, and often it's a last resort, because if it goes too far, if it becomes too sadistic, if it becomes too gratuitous, we will lose the ability to identify with the protagonist who's making use of that violence. And so this film has to walk a very fine line, because it has to do two things at once. It has to keep us identified with the protagonist, but it also has to illustrate that he's a villain. And so his violence can't be so disproportionate that we completely lose connection to him, but and so it has to be moralized. You know, you get the Wall Street bros who seemed like they had it coming, but also he hunts down the last one at the end, the guy who's wounded and pathetically trying to crawl away and pleading in a way, and kills him. And that's something that usually would be a deal breaker as far as the audience's connection to a typical protagonist of the movie. The protagonist would just become straightforwardly a bad guy. What we know is that, okay, he's becoming a supervillain, so we're willing to tolerate a certain amount of that. We understand his role in that universe. And then it's only at the very end that we get of the movie where we get a killing that is arguably just against someone who's obviously innocent, and that is left off screen. So you just get to see, you get the hint that he's killed this hospital worker, and you see the bloody footsteps. But you know, I think that's the right move, because I think if the film completely shies away from the idea of his full villainy, it hasn't succeeded. So in this movie, it's like a complicated use of violence, I think. There are lots of movies, of course, in which we see bad guys killing lots of people, and we identify with horrible people, but they're usually killing worse guys, right? So if it's a mob movie, you know, the mob character we're identifying with is killing worse mob characters and things like that. But
he's also killing his mother and a father substitute. So that's also particularly interesting in the,
she had it coming.
you know, that talk about the fantasy we can all share. I mean, that's really pretty amazing to see in a movie.
Yeah.
And,
Sorry.
yeah.
I just wanted to say that the last killing that you're referring to me, is like the top of that social pressure, where it turns around against us and then kills the social worker, which is trying to help all these people like him. And that's like where the circle of violence ends, in repeating itself. So to me, it just makes sense that it will be that first, that symbol.
But there was something about the social worker that, you know, she actually didn't seek him like all the others didn't seek him. And I think he tried to communicate to her that there was something about not being seen, not being acknowledged, that he exists, that fuels the violence inside and kind of puts him into bits and pieces, which I kind of think at the end of the movie, all these people that he got surrounded by are these bits and pieces. And I think that, you know, the cycle it didn't get interrupted with this social worker,
No, of
because
course, no.
she failed to see him as well.
Well, there's two social workers, right? So one in the middle,
Oh, they're the one in the middle.
early
I'm
part of the
thinking
film, and then one in the later. But for him, they might as well be the same.
Yeah.
So that's
Right, which has something to do with with the core of it, like existing in someone's mind in the first place.
I think she does name it, though. She does say, when he says, how am I supposed to get my medication? Who am I supposed to check in with? And she does say,
They don't care about people like us.
they don't care about people like us.
Yeah.
She goes with him in a way, but I think she misses what he's saying, and it doesn't.
He can't see
seem
her
to- yeah.
anymore. Like he's the one that becomes blind now to the other.
Well, no one sees anyone until the very end of the film when he leads basically an entire riot in the city.
Well, that's actually what was kind of most interesting to me is like this end riot scene and this idea of being seen. Because the role that the face painter, this mask, is playing in the film is very significant. And then when Mr. Alwan mentioned that people in Queens are dancing down the stairs, then I was like, okay, so part of the end of the film, when everyone's in this clown mask, everyone is the Joker. And then this is also actually happening as a real response to the film. People are dancing down the stairs, getting in costume. And I'm sure it was one of the most popular Halloween costumes of the year. So, I mean, to the degree of identification and like really playing the role, I mean, it's definitely resonated on a really real level.
Well, isn't it a triumph to be able to enjoy the falling? You know, like he's literally going deeper and deeper into his fall down the stairs, and that's where he gets the glory. As the deeper he goes into that.
And the more precarious it gets, yeah.
But it's like people identifying with him or identifying with his mask, like with something empty. There's nothing like what are they identifying with?
Right.
The mask.
But he even put the mask on to hide. He had his makeup on, but then he had to put the mask on so he could hide from the cops too. So even he didn't want to be seen for who he really was at that point in the movie. Anyway.
I feel like if I was gonna dress up as the Joker because of this movie, it wouldn't be to like because I identified, but rather because I'm like, or maybe because I identified, I'm trying to like push it away from myself and kind of make it funny and make it not as serious. Because I remember like when I saw this movie with my roommates and like walked out of the AMC and at like 1 a.m. or something, and then like walked through Boston, it was very, very uncomfortable. And like trying to get those ideas out of my head, and I ended up having this like long conversation with my roommates about like what like violence and like when violence is okay and like if violence is okay and like what would you do if like someone like did this to your girlfriend and like because when you identify with the Joker, it's like oh well he does this, and like sometimes when he does that stuff it feels like a normal thing, but I think the people dancing down the stairs, maybe an uncomfortable identification with the protagonist is really what's going on.
I think that's the significance of the film, highlighting, I remember even before I saw the film, I saw the trailer, and I labeled it and I said, this is the making of a psychopath. I have to go see it. And now the whole world sees how the system fails somebody who can control his paranoia, tied to medication. Had he not, he becomes a criminal psychopath. When pushed to that level, unmedicated, where the paranoia and the illusionary world, and it's done in such an artistic way, when it pretty much guides him through life, and it opens this person who goes on a vengeance. He loses self. There's no more reality. By the end of it, we see Joker that we've seen in those villain films, but it's really this whole path of not being able to control his, hallucinations, learning about violence and trauma, which is usually statistically, right? There's a high childhood abuse, when you lead into a path into like a criminal psychopathic life. There's that. There's so many things that add to it. And then you're off your meds, you lose your head, and we see him losing his head. And I remember, this is probably the most important film. I have no doubt, I hope it will get an Oscar, for not just for the role, Joaquin Phoenix did an incredible job, for the directorship, for writing the music. The combination of it, I could relate, because when I left the theater, I got in my car, and my partner laughed like the Joker. He did this, And I turned around and went, did you just do that? Because I felt like I was in this film where the shade of a tree didn't look the same. I felt disturbed. That whole translated to me, and it was really scary. Where the world seemed like a scary place. Please tell me you just did this, that I didn't just imagine that you'd laugh. And that laughter, oof, it shook me. Oh.
I remember, like, I would agree that, like, yeah, society definitely failed him, but I'd also say that, like, he's intensely happier when he's off his meds and going crazy and killing people. So, like, what really was his quality of life when he was on his meds and not hurting anyone? He was kind of, like, just, like, pushing in and pushing in and pushing in, and then he was off his meds, and he's probably a more self-fulfilled person, killing everyone.
I mean, the only pleasure he can get is like beyond what is like either he lives a life that's totally desolate and like sorrowful, or he like goes beyond. The only pleasure he gets is transgressive, so it's like the jouissance. It's like beyond the thing, and I think that's again why people are dancing down the stairs. They're filled with that sense of like this guy did it, whether it's someone had it coming to him or whatever. He went beyond what's permissible, and that in itself, that freedom.
And this is a way that he can connect to people. So if someone really is, if they really have lost all connection to humanity, then unfortunately violence does make sense. I think we tend to think, well, yeah, that we can help them, and so it doesn't. And of course, we have to stop them anyway because we care about the well-being of ourselves and society. But from the standpoint of someone who really has lost all connection, if violence is the only means, then it makes sense internally to pursue it. And the movie needs that. Like the protagonist, if he's not to become dramatically inert, has to be doing the best that he can under the given circumstances. So it's important that we don't just see him as a victim of society, because then he's without agency and that becomes uninteresting. He has to be more than a function of social circumstances, and yet there are real boundary circumstances under which curtail his options, the options for his agency. So, but I think we, as perverse as it might be, we can identify with. I think we can all identify with his social alienation or the fear of that type of social disconnection, the ostracism. We can all at a deep level identify with that, and so we can identify with the vindication, the violent vindication that would restore us. Of course, I'll leave it at that. Maybe I'll have more to say about that later.
Well, I want to talk more about, because you just brought up the word alienation. This is in the first place is Hegel's term, and next it was like used by Karl Marx. Marx's way to use this word alienation is that he first said that the workers are alienized, their labors, their works are alienized because the works no longer serve for themselves; they serve for the capitalist. And the more they work, the capitalist becomes stronger. The bosses, the rich, become stronger, and in contrast, they become like weaker. The more they work, the weaker they become. And in this case, the laughter. Well, there is one criticism in like Zizek or something like that, is like we need some kind of like a surplus enjoyment to maintain this whole society structure. But the Joker is not the case, because Joker, he alienates not only his work but also his enjoyment and his laughing, he provides others with laughter, with joy, with enjoyment, but at the same time, as an alienation, he lost it for himself.
Say the last sentence. At the same time, the alienation. What?
there is an alienation of his laughter. He have to like provide laughter for other people in order to earn money or something like that. But at the same time, because it's an alienation, he provides the jokes or something to other people. At the same time, he lost it for himself. He no longer feels enjoyment in it. So
Enjoyment
in himself. I mean, he
telling
can,
jokes or
in jokes, in anything that the society provides to maintain the status quo. Well, the society like the like cultural capitalists or something like that, the cultural thing like the movie, something like that. For example, in our society, our like movies, superhero movies, maintains some kind of like a hallucination or fantasies for ourselves. It is a product for ourselves in order to maintain the tension between the classes. However, this is kind of a compromise, but this kind of compromise lost its effect on the Joker. So the Joker became like, well, out of the society becomes like alienized people or something like that.
Well, I'm trying to think through what you're it's a very complex comment, but interesting, so I'm trying to think it through in real time.
I had an association. My one association while he was speaking was that somebody was making money selling all the Joker masks. So it was really hard to escape capitalism in that particular way.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking out loud, I'm not sure this will be helpful. So labor, in order to not be alienated, has to be a way of achieving recognition. So the sort of thing that Ms. Reshkova was talking about, his feeling of invisibility, some of our sense of self, and this goes to Hegel's psychological theory, is built up of the recognition of others, which is a very fraught relationship and involves what he calls a master-slave dynamic, the kind of obsessional need to try and control the recognition of the other, and then working out of how you're going to resolve all that stuff. For Hegel, what the slave got out of their position is the ability to know themselves through their work, so to actually sublimate, to actually have that kind of maturity, and in the position of mastery, in that manic defense, you don't get to sublimate, even if you get to dominate other people, even if you do succeed in controlling them. And so now I'm trying to connect this to. So it's, for Marx, it becomes hard to sublimate. It becomes hard for you. Your day job no longer becomes something satisfying and pleasurable and enriching in your life if it's driven by a division of labor where you're doing horrible industrial jobs, right? Repeatedly doing something on an assembly line or something like that. So in the case of Arthur Fleck, the Joker character, I think obviously he's looking for that. He has an off the beaten path kind of job, and he aspires to it. So he wants to be a stand-up comedian. He's being a clown. He's doing in a way all the right things. He just lacks the social capacity to do it. I'm not sure I see a clear connection to capitalism in the film. There's a circumstantial connection in the sense that he's not provided with mental health services. Anyway, sorry, I'm trying to think out loud. Maybe that's helpful.
But he also represents society. I mean, he is an individual. As an individual, he's mentally ill, and he goes through all of that. But what he does represent society, and I think the comment about Marx, I don't know Marx very well at all, but just as a member of society, and at the end, when he is dancing again on top of the car, and all these people are kind of like looking at him, he's created all this chaos by his actions, fighting against the man, as it were. And so I think that makes sense.
So he would deny this though, and he does deny it, and I believe him in the film. So
no, he totally
his
denies it.
ambitions are not political.
No, they're not. He
It's
would never
important
be-
that they not be political. It's important that other people be providing the political
No,
it's important that the populace of Gotham be politically aroused by what he's doing, but for him, the objectives can't be political because that's not the way he thinks of people. He thinks people are, as he said in the talk show, awful, universally awful. And that's a very important conclusion for him psychologically. Because I think people would disagree.
Well,
So, yeah.
I just think like, I mean, he's not political, but the fact, like he's basically like in a clown assembly line that's disconnected from his laughter. Like a clown makes laughter, he doesn't laugh at what's funny. It's like that disconnect is like kind of like what you were just talking about, like the alienation, like what he creates as laughter is something that he has no connection with anymore in like this kind of society. So I don't know, I think that is what I saw as a
And he
connection.
also caused the riot on the subway as well, when everybody's wearing the masks and he needed to escape. And the gun accidentally went off and they started beating on the cops and the cops ended up getting beaten and he caused that. He didn't know that he caused it or I think he was actually pleased that he caused that. But, you know, he's apolitical, absolutely.
If at any point in the film the directors had him purposefully lead a riot,
No, they didn't.
it would have been
He didn't
it would have
consider
been a
himself.
dramatic mistake. But sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's just that's not. I think people disagree and probably have good counterpoints here.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think like he's right. The film does try to make the connection that like, and I think it ties into the victim of circumstance kind of thing that keeps getting brought up. But I don't like while it's like, oh, he didn't have his meds and this, like, I think that he would still feel equally like powerless even if he was in a higher social class or powerful. Like if you look at like a Nero or a Caligula or something, like very, very powerful figures who were very, very crazy, who ended up just being, I think, killed by the people around them. So I don't think like social class really plays into it that much.
I think Joker's supposed to function sort of as a Rorschach test, where you're supposed to impose whatever like enemy against Joker that you would like to see. You know, I guess maybe if you're left-leaning, you see him as a victim of capitalism, or if you're right-leaning, you see him as like a victim of a godless society. So it's really for the audience to make up their mind.
Well, I think, sorry, it's a complicated issue because we're all victims of capitalism, but he's also the victim of a very severe developmental trauma, and so then it becomes a difficult, a very complicated question of how those play together. But I think I cut you off earlier, so yeah.
I think that's. I mean, I'm not in the psychoanalytical world or anything like that, but I very much saw it as a critique of capitalism. I mean, the class edge I thought was pretty clear. He's poor, he's, as he was saying, alienated in a menial, low-paying job. The alienation was clear. I thought it was very tangible. He's angry at billionaires, the people that run society. They play on this a lot in the movie. They have pictures of these wealthy, successful people talking about how their belief in a meritocracy, they got there because they deserved it. The other people don't really know how to save themselves, and they need these, basically the aristocracy, right? Rule by the best, who need to save these pathetic underlings that can't somehow figure it out. I mean, that whole conception of society is placed in question by this film. I mean, and then, yeah, you pointed out, I think correctly, they drew a direct link between the types of things we're seeing under capitalism now and mental disorder. We know there's a correlation. I mean, I don't know all the technical research, but we know there's a correlation between the two. We're seeing it now in reality. That's surely part of the reason why the film's so popular, is people see its contemporary relevance because of that. But you pointed out, like, he got the funding cuts, he couldn't get his meds. Like, they're trying to draw a direct link between the way this social system is working and his problems. they don't portray him as just an isolated, in my opinion, they don't portray him as just an isolated freak with problems. Like, there's a reason his problems and his revenge that he takes on these Wall Street guys inspires a mass movement. Like, his problems aren't his problems. I mean, he has a severe case, he has lots of trauma, but his problems are felt by lots of people. I just don't see it.
That's very well put. Did you,
Oh,
I thought you
no.
were gonna say
I
something
was
about
just
that.
gonna say, because we were talking a little bit about like the mental health components of the film, and I mean, it did directly tie in terms of like, I mean, having the social worker, but even, you know, eventually it went into his kind of his history and the mother as being a schizophrenic and a few other things. But I remember, I can't recall exactly what the case was, but like, I remember it didn't make sense. Like, there was a lot, it seemed kind of like conflicting in a lot of ways in terms of the psychological background they were giving. And for me, it seemed like the film, if anything, like, was a critique of, or it showed our lack of ability to actually understand mental illness, like on a very basic level. Cause in a sense, I was like, oh, I like don't know like what this guy's, like what this is about, like what his situation, what he's presenting with. There are all of the like sociological elements in play, but as far as like getting a sense of this character like clinically, I was like, oh, like I can't like touch this. It's all like really convoluted and we don't know what's going on. The cases don't make any sense. And I was like, oh, that's actually pretty accurate. We like really don't know like what this type of thing is, and like we make a really good attempt with our particular work to arrive there, but something about it was like seemed beyond what could be conceptualized, and that's why the Rorschach comment really resonated with me, because it's like, oh, we're creating the meaning, like this is just all there.
For me, one of the saddest moments in the film was when he was on the bus and he was playing with the kid, he was entertaining the kid with all the different faces, and the mother yelled at him saying like, why are you messing with my kid? And then he starts laughing and he passes that card saying, you know, I have a condition that I just laugh, sometimes I have no control over it. And I thought that was actually like a real tragedy, which I connected to the end when we were getting the litany of things that he had experienced with his mother. I mean, and the thing that, you know, it's always interesting for me, the phrases that stick in my mind, how he was chained to a radiator and probably had brain damage from not only the mother, but from the mother's, you know, boyfriends and series of men that came through the house. And, I mean, that's tragic.
Do we know, I just was wondering what the group thinks, do we know what happened to his imaginary girlfriend? Do we think she got hurt?
So I can tell you what the director said.
What
The
do you
director
What do
actually,
you think first?
yeah, that's maybe that, yeah.
It looked because the door was unlocked, she didn't lock the door. So he opened the door freely and he sat on the couch. And by that point, that's it, the meds were out of the system. And there were all those moments where you could see he was actually by himself, but he imagined her. This whole relationship was beautiful. And she comes out and says, I know you. You're the neighbor from upstairs. Because that scene with the elevator. And this is the moment where we know that was not real. That's a very clear illustration to the audience that he imagined the whole thing. And she says, and he looks at her and says, I had a very bad day. I was so afraid that, to me, it looked like she didn't come out alive. Because there was no follow-up to tell me that maybe she was okay. Did he leave? I don't see him leaving at that point. Did he have a gun with him? I don't remember. If he did, he probably definitely.
When did that happen? What was the sequence? Where did that fall in the
He had
sequence?
just figured out that like he had been adopted, and then he left the place, and it was like raining, and he went to go.
I think he just killed. Did he just kill his mom with a pillow?
I think
It was right after.
Right.
So he came to the closest next person to him, which was his imaginary girlfriend. So he just murdered the closest person, his mother. So, I mean, I was really. They didn't show that, because had they done that, that would have been. I feel like it would have curtailed the movie into a whole another thing. But what did the director say?
Do you guys really want to know? From you. Does anyone have the opposite feeling about or
Yeah,
whether or not he killed
I
them.
think she would have stayed alive.
Yeah, I have the same.
Because she's the good object, the
Yeah.
protection of
Yes.
the good, so she's, the reaction of I just had a bad day is a way to protect her, like, don't get close. Is a
I
way
would
to-
believe she was alive.
Huh?
I want to believe she's alive.
She's
Yeah.
alive.
But basically, I think it doesn't matter because he is now.
Like, she never wronged him, and everyone
Just
who
like
took
the
out
little man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same thing.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, that's an interesting thing in another way, the little man, because he does express pretty high empathy toward the little man. And it's one way when you were talking earlier about if it goes too far, it won't work. Well, he's just gone very far with the former coworker. But they sort of bring it in both for humor and also, I mean, it's a sort of a very empathic response at that point, and at least it keeps you identified with him too at that point.
Yeah, I think that's another subtle and clever scene because he, he's sparing the little guy, but also he has a very cavalier attitude. He doesn't fully grasp how afraid the little guy is.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you remember just sort of the tone of his response. It's like he doesn't, when the little guy can't reach the doorknob and comes back to ask to be helped out, he's afraid of being killed.
Yeah.
And Arthur Fleck treats it in a very cavalier, laughing sort of way. But on the other hand, I think your point is right. It's also, he's highly empathetic in his own way.
Because you saw him being put down by
Yeah.
society as well, by
Right.
making fun of him and stuff.
Well, actually, I
So
think
it's-
I would understand this way because I remember that I saw in some kind of like a TV series or something who said that it's powerful to kill somebody, but it is even more powerful to spare somebody. So he is now the one who has power. So it is his right, his power to spare his or her life. The little guy,
Yeah.
he can kill the big guy and spare the little guy, but he can also like kill his mother and spare his like mother and girlfriend. It's up to him, and he becomes someone who has power. So it is actually, I think it's some of his game. I don't know.
I still think some humanness comes through there. That it's not just the power trip, but because he is identified with the small guy who's been prejudiced against and so forth, and there is an empathy and a connection.
So I honestly, I did see it as a mix of those two things. I felt something sadistic about him, how cavalierly he reacted when the guy came back to ask to be let out, and it was really disgusting and horrifying in a way. Just the Fleck's lack of comprehension. In a way, it's like he failed to comprehend how awful and traumatic what he's just done is to another person. But on the other hand, I think you're right. There's he's observing a kind of code there about who deserves to be spared and who doesn't. So I think it was walking that kind of line that I described before, and it's trying to go over it enough that you feel. I mean, at least I felt really disgusted and horrified by all that. The violence is moralized. The guy betrayed him, gave him the gun, got him fired, all that stuff. But still, it's repellent, and it's not the type of things you would see in many of these types of movies. It's a graphic, violent scene. So anyway, it gets some real complexity in there with all that stuff.
I think there are a lot of things about this movie that you don't know what's real and what's not, and I love that about this movie because it really stays true to the Joker, where his past is unknown and it's a multiple choice, and Arthur is not a reliable narrator, so the entire girlfriend scenes were not real. What else wasn't real? I looked at some YouTube videos, and if you go back and watch the movie, all the clocks say the same time.
That's wonderful.
Could this not be a thing? There's that scene where he's talking to the social worker, and it does a quick clip to him just banging his head against the wall in the white room. So how do we know that that social worker's real? Is she the same, his idea of the same woman at the end? Like, there's just a lot of things going on where, like, you just don't even know. You can't trust the actual story, which is one of my favorite parts about the movie.
Did you see the twist coming with the girlfriend being imaginary? I didn't.
I didn't see it at all, but when it happened, it just, like, especially after the fact when I kind of watched all the YouTube videos about, you know, conspiracies about the Joker, it's just like, it was not only that, but so many other little things that just could have just not happened.
I think we're getting closer, a little closer to the answer, though, of why is this movie so disturbing?
Well, I wanted to say, to kind of respond to your comment, I actually kind of thought that the girlfriend was imaginary, because wherever you have the image of the mother who's kind of horrible, you're gonna get the imaginary image of someone who's wonderful. And, you know, in that sense, I kind of thought, well, you know, I guess he kills his father and his mother, which is, you know, kind of, I kind of looked at the movie as this big, giant wishful thinking in terms of, like, the Joker is, you know, maybe a little bit of each one of us. There's like a Joker, and we want to kill our mothers and fathers in a certain sense, but then he actually goes off and does it because he's out of control. And then he also gets his imaginary, you know, kind of friends to support him in the whole ordeal. And then the more he imagines, the more imaginary they get, the more his actions become more and more horrible. Like, eventually he kills people. Right. So there's like the split grows and grows and grows through the movies.
I mean, but in terms of like the fantasy and the reality, which is definitely like up for question, like the film, I mean, it's a dream. A film is someone's dream. So I mean, there's really, I think again, that's what's kind of maybe like how it can resonate with so many people on so many levels. Again, in this sort of very idiosyncratic way, is because like a dream, it kind of certain parts stay with us while others leave.
I was just wondering, like, what was the motive behind like going to the talk show? Because like he goes in so emotionally charged, and he thinks that's where he's going to kill himself with the joke, but then like he kills the host. But it's like I was just wondering, like, what did he expect? Like, what did he really think that he will be well received with the show? Like, did he not think of the possibility that he'll be made fun of?
I think, well, the way it's on the surface level it's set up is he is going there to avenge himself because the talk show host took a video clip of him doing stand-up and ridiculed him for that. And so, yeah, and then invited him to ridicule him some more. So he is going to get revenge for that, and doesn't, to my view, doesn't seem to be thinking a lot about what's going to happen next. He's just,
like,
but yeah.
revenge by killing himself?
I thought he had gone to plan. I thought he had just planned to kill the talk show host. Am I wrong about that?
Because he made that comment. He made that comment, and the practice was that he was gonna. But I never believed that he would actually do that. I thought. I never believed he would actually like shoot. I thought it would be like a blank, whatever you call it. I don't know the term. A blank bullet. I don't know what you call it.
It's called a blank.
Yeah, a blank. There you go. I thought it would just be like
I thought it was a good illustration.
When people say he killed the father, is that what they mean? Is the talk show host?
Yeah.
The talk show host is the imaginary father.
Well, the wished for father.
The wished for, yeah, the wished for father.
He has that earlier fantasy.
Yeah.
You guys remember the earlier?
I wish I had a son like you.
Yes, I wish I had someone.
Somebody else.
No, I mean, like,
Dr. Wagner.
Sorry, obviously in the movie, like, he wasn't gonna kill himself, but like, I was just wondering.
We don't wanna hear from you, Dr.
Yeah,
Wagner.
sorry.
No.
I know, keeps trying to.
I'm trying to answer your question.
Go ahead.
I think it illustrates well that a revenge motive in suicide is
essentially equivalent to the revenge motive in homicide, right? He could punish this failed father by shooting himself on his television show or by shooting him. Either of those would be a triumph in the mind of this character.
So like what turned that around for him?
That I don't know. I don't think there was any indication of a turning point there, but I think that the director did set us up to think he was gonna shoot himself.
I would say, like, it's almost like, which is like the healthier choice. Like in the end, he chose to not kill, like, it's like, I feel like he had to make a choice, and I feel like he did the right one. Like, I don't know, like, he did the right thing.
I think, like, sitting there, he was able to actually see him as a separate person, and not his father. I think he had, like, a moment of clarity sitting there, and when he was making fun of him, he was able to see, like, he's not my father, and he's not me, so I will kill him and not kill myself. That's kind of how I think of it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
It's always healthier to kill other people.
I think that's why, like, to me, it's probably like the most honest illustration of, compared to everywhere else where we see a little bit of empathy and a little bit of humanistic, this is one scene that is most honest of a psychopath who has no empathy. They would not kill themselves, they would kill others. The narcissism doesn't allow you to go and shoot and direct this towards self. The only way you can avoid doing that is by murdering others. And he did it publicly on TV, which actually kind of translated, it's like a wave to people. How many people watch television? It inspired and brought the making of creation of a Joker. I feel like the timing, somebody mentioned the timing of this film and the timing of his circumstances in life, how depressed society was, and they needed a crazy leader, they needed a motivation, inspiration. And his appearance on TV inspired a war against the man, right? Against the government, the wealthy, the capitalist. And it's so significant because he did it on television. That's all. That was the creation, of a wave of a political infrastructure. Like a, question.
I guess I wanted to just say, I don't see him as a psychopath. I think actually, I was really taken by the film as an illustration of what we study here all the time about the breakdown of schizophrenic defense, because his defense was working well for him in the beginning, and he was living in a very illusory delusional world, which was intruded upon. He got off the medication, but also he was just intruded upon by reality in various ways. The schizophrenic defense broke down, and he became in touch with his rage and very, very violent. So I thought it was a brilliant portrayal of mental illness and psychotic breakdown. The other thing that really disturbed me was how, the social context was important, but showing how, given enough rage and disempowerment and oppression, how any leader will do, including a really mentally ill one. And I think the parallels to where we are today cannot be escaped. So I found that really disturbing.
Yeah, the appeal of the id.
That's
what you have now, and I was thinking of that in this movie too. The appeal.
And
If you have grievance, to have the appeal of the leader who operates
Pure
on id.
destruction.
And he's the leader that did that. I was thinking of our training here too, in the sense of the first half of the movie. We're trained here to sit with all sorts of feelings and to sit with and be with the patient. And it's a very challenging thing because it challenges every part of our minds. And so to sit with all sorts of the whole range of feelings, and the first hour for me was intolerable. I kept looking at my watch. I love movies, but I was like, this is 2 hours. that's how he was a wonderful actor because you were with him in that depression and hopelessness. And I kept thinking, well, this guy does live though, because he's in a lot of other movies. I kept trying to go but no good can come of this. I kept feeling like there was just this buildup of the depression. And so the resistance or the tension that was building up in me and in him, simultaneous, so the relief when he started killing people was just fabulous for me. And I think it was another way to be with him. It was a break, it was a psychotic break, but the pleasure of not having that depression was real. It made me understand why people go there. And he just did it in such a wonderful way. So I left the movie also feeling great. And I was thinking, this is interesting. I was all wired up. It was tragic, but I was like, okay, this is okay. I'm gonna be a group leader, and there's Bruce Wayne. He's gonna run into him again. That's interesting how that was. And then I wonder if he really is that guy's son, because I believe that he could have impregnated his mother very easily and set up the whole adoption. That was there too. Anyway, I'm going on, but tolerating all of those feelings is what you work with when you're a clinician to help people.
Understanding how other people get there, but also having the awareness that we can get there.
Yes,
that's the mirror part. The film for me is how, if you really honestly sit there, you have to put yourself in the role of the Joker, the role of the protagonist, and how quickly any of us could slide in there. And that's, I think, what's really disturbing for a lot of people. I said I saw it once. I immediately told you, I think we have to do a movie thing on this. And then I was like, okay, once we agreed to do it, I'm like, I need to see it a second time. And I spent about 4 weeks of avoiding it. So I have not seen it a second time. I've only seen it once. But some of the imagery just stays with me so much.
Well, I want to say something. My experience in watching this movie is like good all along, because I think I have read a lot of Marx, so I think I was traumatized before, like I was
traumatized by Marx.
Yeah, you're right. In Marx criticisms, actually, I've seen like a lot of facts that's really disturbing. For example, like how much does the workers' work actually goes into himself? That is like a very little percentage. They're like Marxist economists analyzing and calculating all of that. So I was like traumatizing like previously, but like I built up some defense on it. So I actually felt like really 100% good in watching this movie. So
revolutionary action.
I recommend you all read some Marx. I think it is good for like a psychoanalytic practice.
We could have a Marx and the Joker class.
I have a question following Dr. Schneider's comment. Was when you said the breaking down of the schizophrenic defense, you said it was the illusion. The illusions no longer were
illusions and delusions.
enough.
Yeah, it was okay in the beginning in this very illusory world, right? Yeah.
But then it made me think. So his the father he wished for, the talk show host, that idealized father. So is that part of the connection? Is once he saw that this man that he idealized was making direct fun of him, was that part of just the unraveling, once he realized, like,
wake up call?
This
learned
person
about
I idealized
his mother. He really idealized his mother also, and he was taking care of her, and turned out she was a horrible mother when she found out, right? And then killed her.
Right, yeah.
You didn't have
I'm
to
just
give her
because I'm wondering
vaccine.
what happened right after that.
Don't bathe her.
Yeah.
Because you might have to kill her.
Yeah.
I'll pay you again.
What, I'm just wondering, I now wanna watch it again, cause I just wanna know what once he saw that in the hospital room, that scene of the talk show host, he was so happy and then you just see him crumble as he watches it. What happened after that? Does anyone remember? I wanna watch it again.
I don't remember
Well,
seeing
I was wondering about the refrigerator. Remember
Oh,
when he went to the refrigerator?
yeah.
When did that happen? What, was that related?
That was like banging a head against the wall. Like that was a clip that like I think.
We went inside the fridge.
Yeah,
He was preparing for to go to the talk show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Timing.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah, the scene like he was still in the kitchen, but then like that happened and there was no like follow up of like what it was just like do a new scene.
That was a completely improvised scene, by the way.
Yeah.
That was not in the script. That was just Joaquin Phoenix did.
Oh, can I say?
As was the dancing scene in the bathroom.
Can I say something about the? I don't know how many of you are familiar with Roland Barthes, the French
I thought it was
philosopher.
going to be Marx
I'm sorry? That is not Marx. Well, he is the one. He's a French philosopher, and he suggested a theory of like the author is dead. His
The death of
meaning,
the author is the
death
name
of the
of
author.
the
Yeah. He mean by you don't actually have to like interpret all the details of this work, because even the director himself doesn't have the full right to explain it all, because it is not made by him his own, but also made by all the ideology, all the society, all the the basic things. So he is not the only author of this, so he does not have the full right to interpret it all. So it is actually everybody's right to interpret it, or even you can put in some plot into it. I mean, you can put in your own plot into it and to make your own version of stories. And many people's stories can make like a variation, something like that. I think you can understand it this way instead of like discussing about what really happened here and there. I think that is not that meaningful, maybe.
Well, it's a very complicated topic, and I'm going to plug my podcast partially to we did a big episode on authorial intent, and we read that essay and many others. But I'm not sure. I think that might be a false dilemma. I think you can look at it in both ways. You can be very anti-authorial intent, which I share that with you, but you can also be interested in what really happened in some other sense. But I thought some other people were getting ready to respond to it. Yeah.
Speaking of the author and speaking of the dream, I'm thinking that, and I think you said this in an earlier context, that the Joker character in the Batman films is in the mind of the audience. It's not in the mind of Fleck. So if you think of whose mind the story is taking place in, part of we are, by the hand of the director, writing that part of the story into the psychotic decompensation of this individual person in the social context that we see him in. And I think that's really interesting in and of itself, and also as a way to understand how empathy works and what we're bringing, what we're adding, that we know. And the other thing is, you could read it, you had mentioned the dream movie, you could read it as his retelling of his life, his imaginary telling of his life while he's in the hospital. What if he's in the hospital the whole time? And he's soothing himself by telling this story about how he became a cultural icon and so on. Telling and retelling. So again, that could go to what you're saying about the suicide and the homicide. He's playing, I think, with ways to tell his story if you're looking at it as a retrospective telling. And in that way, it's very much like, someone coming to analysis and telling you the emotional story of their life. it's not always the same story, there are new things that occur, there's a context that you have as the analyst that you're bringing, that the person speaking to you doesn't necessarily know, and it's very much like, the experience of watching the film and the layers of empathy therefore.
Well, and that possibility is raised at the end with the ending, that
Yeah.
it might all be a story or a fantasy.
So that did happen. There was, because I couldn't remember if that scene was there, and I was like, I think the whole
They throw everything into
Right.
a whole different dimension.
Yeah, so I think that in itself, like, I mean, one, it's almost reflective of the conversation and how kind of dreamlike and fragmented that it's been, these different elements that crop up. But yeah, because I couldn't remember exactly that it occurred. So yeah, it's kind of like Alice in Wonderland.
At the end, what are you talking about?
That like there's some scene at least that where we have a sense he's back in the hospital or
Yeah.
he's there, and it becomes a bit perplexing if any of this occurred, if any of it was real or if it was fantasy. And I think that pivot point is like, also shows a lot in our responses to that, and like what really happened in this film, and is that meaningful, and all these sorts of things.
Dr. Wagner, can you say a little bit more about how you're using empathy? I don't understand quite what you're saying with empathy in this
Well,
context.
I think I'm using it in different ways, but one answer to Dr. Sharp's question about why the film is so disturbing is that we are feeling sympathetic with a character who is a murderer and an out of control maniac, you know, and it's necessary to be able to connect empathically with anyone and everyone, right? If we're gonna survive our current condition, or if we're gonna talk to another person, if we're gonna be an analyst, if we're gonna be an analysan, these things are, we have to feel everything, and we have to feel ourselves into the subjectivity of the other person, be affected by them, be occupied by them, and the movie really occupies the audience.
We have about 10 more minutes, so if you haven't said something, here's your 10-minute warning. Think about what you might want to say.
I think there was so many uncanny moments in the movies that I found myself feeling like I know stuff about this, I know the reality of it, but then I found myself lost again. And I think they did a great job in terms of positioning the audience in a place where some of the very primal fantasy would come up that we all know of, but at the same time we don't want to know about. So I think that's part of the reason the film was particularly very disturbing, and we don't want to go and face that again. It really talked to the unconscious, I think, at some level.
I want to piggyback on that comment, that also the character was really well made because there were so much overlap of different characters. You could see Quasimodo, you could see, like, there were like so many different overlaps of the ugly parts of us that we don't want to see. And I think that's part of it.
This was really a movie about the shadow and shadow repression, where the Joker has just been repressing all these violent tendencies with the exact opposite, about making people laugh, making people smile, when in reality he fails to, properly integrate his aggression and really, stand up for himself in a healthy way, whereas a scene in the Wall Street scene where he, viciously guns them down, and where he could have just ended it, in a less brutal fashion, and he becomes sort of, possessed by the shadow, and he continues to kill.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. There's lots of aggression and healthy self-assertion, and that's one of his big problems, is socially, right, is doing that. He doesn't know where to draw the line, and the only place he can be is in a completely overcompensated place of aggression. Sorry.
Yeah, earlier on, in this talk, one of the things I was thinking about was I was going to ask a question why did this make me think of the way I look at homeless people so much? But I think with the reflection stuff, it really answers, because you see them, especially if it's an assertive homeless person, and they're talking to you and stuff, and you have to really interact and it's the same way where it's something that you could be that you don't really want to
Yeah,
Well, what is the feeling, sorry, that you get?
Like, I don't know, like the same feeling when I left the theater of like the dread, like I never want to watch this movie again, but it was like really good.
With a homeless person, I mean.
Well, like, not like someone who's down, like someone who like, is, like you can tell they're like kind of whacked, and they're like talking to you. They're like, I remember I was outside a liquor store once, and this dude like walked up to me, and like big dude, and then he started like talking about some random thing about aliens and stuff, and it was like, all right, well, you know, like, what's he gonna do, and like, could I, like, if I'm a little neurotic or if I'm a little anxious, could I end up being that way or falling that far? It's almost like when they, like in high school, when they would bring a guy who's like, I had my whole college career ahead of me, and then I got addicted to heroin, and I come from a great family and all this stuff, you know?
Yeah, there but for the grace of God.
Yeah.
Or whomever.
I think we invoke the idea of the shadow in an archetypal way too, that the stuff we try to get rid of, I'm not gonna remember the Jung quote exactly, but it's something about how we fear them. And if we just let them kind of fester in the corner, they'll form a mass and come out. It'll be the return of all that stuff that we're trying to not see in ourselves, that we only see in other people. And that could become a real problem. And I think that's kind of also gets to what your comment, Dr. Snyder, about how people impinged in a way that they just kept upping the tension level until we get to what Dr. Hugenberger was saying, like there's just so much pleasure in finally killing. At least it relieves the tension, drops it down for a little bit.
There's I don't know, these two lines in the movie are coming to my mind where it's like the line he says where his mom tells him, his mom says like you're raised to bring joy into the world or something like that, and then there's another line where it's like you're gonna take this like a good little boy or something. Doesn't he say that to the talk show host, like I'm just supposed to like take this like a good little boy, or there's something to, I don't know why that's coming to my mind right now, but that, yeah, just that he never learned to integrate his aggression. It was just, yeah.
Yeah, I think with the whole, he says, you know, when he's disclaiming any political motivation in the talk show scene, he's saying, it's not because of that, it's just because you're awful. And everyone is awful. So, which there's an element of truth in that, right? There are elements of truth in everything that he's learning to do. He's developing perverse variations of, you know, developmental necessities, being able to stand up for himself, understanding that people are awful, but, you know, he should also understand that they're not completely awful and that, you know, and all that stuff. But it's, yeah, I thought that was interesting as well.
So, do you think, you know, when they pull him out of the car at the end after the crash, was that like Jesus symbolism, or?
Oh, he rose from the dead, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Out of the shadows into the light.
Dead and revived.
I'm realizing and thinking about it that, I mean, there was a lot of violence and some of it was disturbing, but the worst thing for me was hearing his history as a child.
Yeah.
That was horrific.
Yeah, was there any point where people teared up, or what was that? Was that the childhood part? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, but the point that in the bus where he was actually trying to interact with the child, and the mother just, which I kind of wonder what the mother represents too.
But does that imply that anyone with a childhood like that is going to be a mass killer?
No.
Not in the
No,
right,
I
not in
think
the right
so, but-
situation.
But what was it about him that drove him to do that versus somebody else who has a similar childhood that doesn't do that?
I had a case, a kid who was worked with for about 2 years or so, who was adopted and who, you know, makes very little contact, sit and or lay down and just doesn't ask much from me. Things had escalated, and then finally got his parents to come into the session, and began to understand. This kid talked about how his parents never got it right. Everything they did was wrong, and that there's no hope in the future. It's never going to get any better. So the past was horrible. The future's going to be horrible. And the one thing that he said, and this is a weird kind of association, where he just said, you know, if you break a phone, you can break a phone like 100 times or 500 times, and then that's it. After it's been broken 500 times, you just can't do anything more. And in that particular moment, I really understood that this kid feels like he's broken beyond repair. And being able to get him to accept what he actually has in this adopted home is part of the work. But he's in an environment, if we can help him stabilize in it, because I think his tendency is to want to get out, right? To destroy this home and to prove that he's just no good. You know, we have that tendency to want to repeat this destructive rejection, because it's actually much scarier to think about being in a place where he actually is loved, and these people invited him into their home through adoption.
You know, Freud, when you talked about Rorschach, Freud said the purpose of drama was for the idiosyncratic experience of each of us to use the trauma, have a little distance because it's not real, but enough connection with the feeling that we can work through a lot. We can identify with all sorts of people and also experience a lot of feeling that we might not in an intellectual way. And I think this evening it's an idiosyncratic tapestry. I always love our discussion of movies because everything people say has value and it weaves into something. And we could spend a lot of time talking about this movie. I wanted to remember all those songs that were in it. That's Life at the end was like perfect. I wanted to go download it. It was a really powerful movie. And you two really made this happen. What you brought to this discussion was really, really wonderful. Thank you very, very much. And thank you. If you would like to be on our mailing list and we don't have your info, please fill out a form at the front.
We bring him into the light. That's the
You're right.
Thank you for your comments. It was very interesting. I must say I agree with you more than I think he did. Towards the end, but I mean the Marx stuff and the capitalist, I don't think he was Joker more as an individual. I think he's more representing society. And the guy over there in front of me does the same thing.
I'll tell you what I feel when I try to like everybody's laughing, but I almost feel the same feeling as the Joker had. Okay. It's almost like I feel like I'm
if you're with a bunch of quietists, so your comments on Marx will be very well received. You're talking about Freud. If you're with a bunch of economists, talking about Freud.
what I felt is like I got certain resistance.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Maybe not in this class, but I think in general what you were saying, I made a lot of sense.
After this is caution. He told me like that once, and it takes his twists and turns. It's interesting to go back and look at it again when it's
Where do you, are you in